part 1. So we're going to look at power, politics, and glory. Our author does a pretty good job of going through a variety of cultures and time periods here. And just be forewarned, there's some disturbing images as we get into the modern era at the end of this chapter. So artwork has promoted, popularized or propagandized governments as well as those who led them. So really we're going to look at a lot of images of the rulers themselves, but also some of the objects that they would own or use. And then also we're going to look at a few things that celebrate peace. But mostly battles and that kind of thing are commemorated, and rulers. So our first one, the glory of the ruler, first thing we're going to look at is the Egyptians. And just remember, the Egyptians had a really long-standing art history. They had their objects and in tombs, so they were preserved. But that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is they had an unchanged visual look to the work. The work looks similar. We all know what an Egyptian artwork looks like, whether we ever cracked a book or not. It's in our culture. We see it everywhere. But it was around for 3,000 years. They have the longest history, and I highly doubt there'll ever be another 3,000-year-long culture. We seem to change so rapidly nowadays. But it was the same sort of look to things. Things changed and modified. So if you look at this dynasty here, but there are also different eras of Egyptian art. It does change a little bit, but generally speaking, it is very similar as you go through history. Now, this one is Menkaure and his wife, and it's important to note he's the pharaoh, but the lineage is it's matriarchal, meaning it goes through the female. So she has to be here to sort of embrace him and show that her son or her children will be the next pharaohs. Okay, so it's going to go through her. The line goes through her, but he is the ruler. When you look at Egyptian art, you're going to look at an idealized body and face. So they're going to be portrayed with full youthful vigor. We see this in Greco-Roman work too, and I would imagine that it came from this Egyptian's history of doing this. So these people could be quite old actually, and not look like this in terms of their physiques. But when the sculptor is going to make this sculpture of them, they're going to do this in the idealized form. And you see this in a variety of cultures, but Egyptian in particular. So there's often symbols that indicate omnipotence, authority, divine blessing, military, or religious power. We don't really see that here in this particular one. You know how we usually have those headdresses with a cobra or something like that. This is pretty simplified. But the other aspect of this is that the Egyptians are after permanence. So you notice how there's no negative space here. There is negative space around his legs, but there's no carving open. It's not open. There's no daylight coming through his legs or his arms here. Even though it's being sculpted somewhat correctly, we're going to leave the stone there because this has to permanently stay in the tomb for millennia. And it has. Think about this. This is perfectly preserved. There's no chips or scratches in this thing. That is mind-boggling. A little bit down here, but that's, really impressive. When you have an arm sticking out like this, it's very likely over years that something's going to move, or it'll be moved incorrectly or something, and it will break. So it was really important that the sculpture is permanent, befitting the divine descendants of the sun god Re. So throughout throughout the culture of Egyptian art, it's very important that the statues stay intact, okay? Because they're very important in terms of maintaining the soul within it. And you get into the Ba and the Ka with these guys, which you did previously. Okay, so they're side by side. What else? Displaying the Egyptian ideal of beauty. And I think that's it on this one. So now we're going to look at Justinian. He was the emperor. This is the Byzantine Empire in 547 547 in the Common Era. That's what the C is. And this is a mosaic. Mosaics were really popular at this time. Mosaics come from, around the year 0 as well, from the Greeks and Romans. And they're finding, it's really kind of interesting, they find mosaics all the time in archaeology when they're looking for pottery and things. Often a mosaic would be on a floor, and they've found several, even in this recent last couple years. It's kind of amazing. This one is on a wall inside of a church. Okay, he's embraced Christianity. He's an early Roman emperor that has embraced Christianity. So he is the central figure, so that's important. So the clergy is over here on his um, left, and then on his right are some soldiers and some military personnel. Okay, I believe these are also religious figures. So these guys, one of them's holding a cross, so that's symbolizing Christ, the book of gospel, and incense. So incense is really important in the church very early on. And he has a halo behind him. You see this halo in many cultures, but that represents divinity. He's wearing a crown, of course, but it's very important that he's centralized so that he's the guy who's in charge. Okay. Another signifier is his purple cloak. Now, it looks kind of blackish to us. Purple was a very difficult color. We're looking at a mosaic made out of, ceramic and stone, perhaps here. But the purple in clothing that it's depicting was very hard to come by. Now, it's one of the few really deep, bright colors. But what would have to happen is you'd have to crush these little snail shells, and they're very small, so you'd have to have thousands of them just to make one dyed garment such as this. So that is why royalty is purple. And you even hear those terms, royal blue or royal purple. Well, those are come from this particular snail that's only found in a very small area of the Mediterranean. There's other places that it's the cochineal little snail has been found in other places since then, but this world was, we haven't ventured. Columbus has not discovered, the Americas yet. Okay, so he's got his purple cloak and his jeweled crown, and he's depicting himself somewhat as a priest. He wants to signify that he's really embracing religion here. So he's carrying a golden bowl with some bread, and we talked about his solar disc. Let's see if we have anything else we want to get into. Oh yeah, the apostles. So he's flanked by 12 figures. It's kind of hard to count them, but there's some people in the back we're counting here. But that's alluding to Christ and the apostles. So he's depicting himself in a Christ-like way, and he is meshing religion and politics, which, of course, in the United States, I know how much we talk about this division of church and state, but that did not exist until, 1700s, okay? So back then, the ruler was a divine person who was a god, or how you want to say it, was a God-given right that he would rule,